Sometimes the loneliest journey a person takes is the one where they believe they've become a burden to the world. In the winter of 1889, a 93-year-old woman named Eliza May stood trembling at a mountain man's cabin door, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "I'm too old to be a wife, and I've got nothing left to offer." She expected rejection. She expected the door to close. Instead, Thomas Bridger, a weathered man who'd lived alone for 20 years, did something that no one saw coming. His response wasn't about obligation or pity. It was about something deeper, something the Old West rarely showed but desperately needed. Simple human dignity. What happened next between these two forgotten souls would challenge everything their community believed about worth, companionship, and what it means to honor another person. What did this mountain man do that left an entire valley speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Bridger had built his cabin with his own two hands in the autumn of 1869, when his back was still strong and his heart was still capable of hope. The structure sat in a small clearing halfway up the eastern slope of what the locals called Sentinel Peak, positioned just right so the morning sun would warm the front porch while the afternoon shade from the towering pines kept the interior cool during summer months. It was a modest place, one main room with a stone fireplace, a separate alcove for sleeping, and a root cellar dug deep into the mountain soil where the temperature stayed constant year-round. Over 20 years, he'd added small improvements: a covered porch to keep firewood dry, shutters that actually fit the windows, a smooth stone path from the cabin to the well he'd dug 30 feet away. He was 68 years old now, though he moved like a man a decade younger. His hair had gone completely white, worn long enough to tie back when he worked, and his beard reached halfway down his chest. His hands were scarred and calloused from decades of labor. First as a cavalryman during the war, then as a ranch hand, and finally as a solitary mountain man who had to be his own carpenter, hunter, and doctor. The lines in his face were deep, carved there by sun and wind and the weight of memories he'd rather forget. Thomas had come to these mountains to escape. After the war, he'd tried to return to normal life, working ranches across Wyoming and Colorado, but civilization felt wrong somehow. Too loud, too full of people who hadn't seen what he'd seen, who couldn't understand the particular silence that falls over a battlefield when the shooting stops. He'd lost his wife Sarah and their infant daughter Margaret to cholera in 1867, back when he still believed he could build a family and forget the war. Their deaths had carved something out of him that never grew back. So he'd walked away from everything: the ranch job, the town, the pretense that he was still the same man who'd left for war in 1861. For 20 years, he'd lived alone. He trapped in winter, hunted year-round, kept a small garden in summer, and spoke to another human being perhaps once every few months when he'd venture down to Timber Ridge to trade pelts for flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. The townspeople knew him as a ghost, a silent figure who appeared and disappeared without ceremony. Some feared him. Most simply forgot he existed until his tall frame materialized at the trading post. He'd made peace with loneliness, or so he told himself. The mountains were his companions. The wind in the pines, the call of eagles, the reliable rhythm of seasons. He had his routines. Morning coffee as the sun crested the eastern ridge, checking his trap lines in winter, tending his garden in summer. Reading by firelight from the dozen books he owned, their pages soft from repeated handling. He'd read them so many times he could recite whole passages from memory. But lately, something had shifted. The silence had grown heavier. The winters felt longer. He'd catch himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. He was getting older, and while his body still served him well enough, he'd begun to wonder what would happen when it didn't. Would he simply die up here alone, his body not discovered until spring thaw? Would anyone care? These were the thoughts occupying his mind on that February morning when he heard the knock. It was so faint he almost missed it. 3 soft taps, barely audible over the wind that whistled through the pines. He set down the leather harness he'd been mending and crossed to the door, wondering if he'd imagined it. Mountain life could do that sometimes, make you hear things that weren't there. But when he opened the door, she was real. The woman standing on his porch was so small and frail she might have been a child, except her face told a different story. It was a map of decades, lined and weathered, her skin like parchment stretched over delicate bones. She wore a threadbare wool coat that had once been blue but had faded to gray, and beneath it layers of patched clothing that still couldn't quite keep out the cold. Her hair, white as fresh snow, was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes, pale blue, almost transparent, held a mixture of desperation and dignity that struck him immediately. She was trembling, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion he couldn't tell. Maybe all 3. "Sir," she said, her voice as thin as paper, "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Eliza May Thornton, and I've traveled 3 days to reach your cabin." She paused, steadying herself against the doorframe. "I've nowhere else to go." Thomas stared at her, his mind trying to catch up with the impossibility of the moment. A woman, elderly and alone, at his door. In February, in the mountains. 3 days, he managed. "From Timber Ridge?" "Yes, sir." She nodded, then seemed to gather herself for something difficult. "I need to be plain with you. I'm 93 years old. I have no money, no family living, and no strength left for labor. The boarding house in town has asked me to leave. Told me to, in fact, because I can't pay the rent. I've been a burden everywhere I've been these past 10 years. Passed from one reluctant relative to another until they were all gone. I heard tell of a man living alone in these mountains, and I thought perhaps—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought perhaps you might allow me to stay, just until spring. I don't eat much. I can sleep anywhere. I won't be any trouble." The wind gusted, and she swayed slightly. Thomas saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the door frame harder. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You telling me you walked 3 days through snow and ice at 93 years old, on the chance I might not turn you away? I had nowhere else to try." Her eyes met his directly, and he saw something there that pierced him, not pleading, but a quiet acceptance of whatever came next. "I understand if you can't help. Most wouldn't. I'm too old to be a wife, if that's what you're thinking. I've got nothing left to offer any man, but if you could spare a night's shelter, I'll move on come morning. I'll find somewhere." She said it with such dignity, such absence of self-pity, that Thomas felt something crack open inside him. This woman, older than anyone he'd ever known, who'd walked 3 days through winter mountains with nothing but a worn coat and the faint hope that a stranger might show mercy. She was still standing straight, still meeting his eyes, still holding on to her pride even as she asked for help. On her left hand, he noticed, she still wore a thin gold wedding band, the metal worn smooth from decades of wear. It caught the weak winter sunlight for just a moment. "Ma'am," Thomas said quietly, "you'd best come inside before you freeze to death on my porch. We can talk about the rest after you're warm." He stepped back, pulling the door wider, and watched as disbelief flickered across her face. She'd expected rejection. She'd prepared herself for it. His simple invitation seemed to confuse her more than a closed door would have. "I meant what I said," she whispered. "I can't offer you anything in return." "I didn't ask for anything," Thomas replied. "Now please, come in out of the cold." Eliza May Thornton took one hesitant step across his threshold, then another, and Thomas Bridger closed the door against the February wind, not knowing that this simple act, opening a door to a desperate stranger, would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine, and would challenge everything their community believed about worth, dignity, and what it means to be human. Thomas guided Eliza to the chair closest to the fireplace, the one with the cushion he'd stuffed with dried grass and covered with deerskin. She sank into it with a small sound of relief, her body seeming to fold in on itself. He busied himself stoking the fire and putting a kettle on for tea, giving her time to catch her breath and warm herself. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of domesticity, the crackle of burning wood, the soft whistle of heating water, the scrape of tin cups on the wooden shelf. "When did you last eat?" he asked, not looking at her directly, sensing she might find that easier. "Yesterday morning. A family gave me biscuits when I asked if I could sleep in their barn." Her voice was steadier now, out of the wind. They were kind, considering. Thomas pulled down his last loaf of bread and cut several thick slices, spreading them with butter from his cold box. He added dried venison and a precious apple from his winter stores. When he handed her the plate, her hands shook slightly as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll pay you back somehow." "Eat," he said simply, and turned back to the tea. They sat in silence while she ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste a single crumb. Thomas found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. She was impossibly small, her frame bird-like, but there was something unbroken in her bearing. She didn't hunch or hide. Even exhausted and desperate, she held her head up. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and settled into the other chair, the one across the hearth from her. The hand-carved chess set sat on the small table between them, pieces frozen mid-game from a match he'd been playing against himself 2 weeks ago. Her eyes landed on it briefly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "You play?" he asked. "I used to. My husband taught me 50 years ago. I wasn't very good." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He always let me win, though I knew it even then." They sipped their tea. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an immense quiet that pressed against the cabin walls. "Tell me about the boarding house," Thomas said eventually. "What happened?" Eliza set down her cup carefully, as if gathering her words. "I've been there 3 years. Mrs. Whitaker, the owner, she's not a cruel woman, just practical. When I first arrived, I had a small pension from my late husband's mining claim. Enough to pay rent and buy food, but the mine played out last year and the payments stopped. I tried to find work, but..." She gestured at herself with a self-deprecating wave. "At 93, there's not much call for your services. Can't sew well anymore. Hands shake too much. Can't take in laundry or clean houses. Can't even watch children. They wear me out in minutes. What about family?" "All gone." She said it without emotion, a fact stated and accepted long ago. "My husband Benjamin died in 1859. Mining accident. We had 7 children. 3 died before their 5th birthdays. Diphtheria and scarlet fever. 2 sons went to war in 61. Neither came home. My eldest daughter lived until she was 42, died in childbirth with her 6th baby. My youngest son made it to 50 before his heart gave out. I've buried every single person I ever loved." The weight of that statement settled over the room. Thomas found he had no words adequate to meet it. "I lived with my daughter's family for a while," Eliza continued, staring into her tea. "But her husband remarried after she died, and his new wife didn't want an old woman underfoot. Then I stayed with my son's widow, but she passed 2 years back. Her children scattered. One went to California, another to Chicago. They sent me to Timber Ridge with enough money for 6 months' rent and a letter explaining my circumstances. That was 3 years ago." She looked up at him. "I've been stretching that money as far as it would go, eating less each month, but eventually it ran out. Mrs. Whitaker asked me to leave 2 weeks ago, gave me until the end of February. So you came here. I heard about you in town. People talk. They said there was a mountain man who lived alone, who came down for supplies a few times a year. I thought..." She hesitated, then pushed forward. I thought maybe a man alone might not mind company, even useless company. I thought I could cook or clean in exchange for a corner to sleep in. But I can see now you don't need those things. You've managed just fine on your own." Her shoulders sagged slightly. It was foolish, walking all this way on hope alone. Thomas set his cup down with deliberate care. "Ma'am, may I call you Eliza?" "Of course." "Eliza, I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear me plain. I'm not asking you to earn your keep. I'm not asking you to be useful. I'm not asking for anything at all." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes steady on hers. "I'm offering you a place to stay. Not just tonight, not just until spring. A place to stay as long as you want it. You'd have the alcove there for your room, privacy when you need it. You'd share my meals. You'd have warmth and shelter. And in return, all I ask is that you accept it." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I don't understand. Why would you do that?" "Because you need it," Thomas said simply. "And because I have it to give. It's as straightforward as that." "But," she struggled with the words, "I told you, I'm too old to be a wife. I can't offer you—" "I'm not asking for a wife," he interrupted gently. "I buried my wife 42 years ago. I made my peace with being alone, or thought I had, but lately I've come to realize that being alone and being lonely are two different things. And maybe I've been the second one without admitting it. You'd be company, Eliza. Another human being to share meals with. Someone to talk to. That's all. Two old people who've outlived everyone they loved, keeping each other company in the time we have left. There's no shame in that." Tears spilled over her weathered cheeks, cutting tracks through the road dust that still clung to her face. "I've been told I was a burden for so long," she whispered. "I started to believe it, started to think that's all I was. You're not a burden to me. You don't know me. I know you walked 3 days through winter mountains rather than give up. I know you're sitting here trying to figure out how to earn something I'm offering freely. I know you've survived 93 years in a world that's hard on everyone and especially hard on women." He paused. "That tells me enough." Eliza pressed her hands to her face, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thomas waited, letting her cry, understanding that sometimes tears were the only possible response to unexpected kindness. He'd cried himself, alone in this cabin, when the weight of loneliness became too much to carry, silently. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but clearer somehow, as if the tears had washed away more than just dust. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, if you're willing. Say you'll stay." She took a shaky breath. "Yes, thank you. Yes." Thomas nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. "Good. Then that's settled. You'll rest today. You're exhausted. Tomorrow we'll figure out the practical details. But for now, you're home, Eliza. You're home." The word hung in the air between them. Home. Such a small word, but it carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything he'd given up on finding again. In that moment, neither of them fully understood what they'd agreed to, what it would cost them, or what they'd gain. They only knew that two lonely people had found each other in the vast wilderness, and something had shifted in both their lives that could never be shifted back. Later, after he'd shown her the alcove and given her clean blankets and a pillow stuffed with pine needles after she'd fallen into an exhausted sleep almost immediately, Thomas sat by the fire with a cup of cooling coffee and stared into the flames. He'd acted on instinct, on a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't charity. He'd never cared much for that word. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. He'd seen himself in her eyes, the particular loneliness of being the last one left. On the mantel above the fire sat a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Sarah and baby Margaret, taken a week before they died. He'd looked at that photograph every day for 42 years, a ritual of remembrance and regret. Now he stood and took it down, holding it carefully in both hands. Sarah's serious face stared back at him, young and full of life she didn't get to live. "I think you'd approve," he said softly to the image. "I think you'd tell me it's about time I let someone else through that door." He placed the photograph back on the mantel. But this time he didn't feel the usual sharp stab of loss. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the faint, unfamiliar stirring of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was providing shelter. He was needed, even if Eliza didn't want to need anyone. And that, he was beginning to realize, might be the most meaningful thing he'd done since he'd walked away from the world 20 years ago. 2 months passed, and the rhythm of life in the cabin settled into something neither Thomas nor Eliza had experienced in decades: contentment. The spring thaw began in earnest, filling the creek with rushing water and bringing the first green shoots up through the softening earth. The world was waking up, and in a way, so were they. Eliza's health improved noticeably with regular meals and proper shelter. The hollow look left her cheeks, and though she would never be robust, she moved with more energy and confidence. Her hands still shook when she sewed or wrote, but the trembling seemed less pronounced, as if her body had decided it could afford to relax a little. More significantly, something had returned to her eyes, a spark that Thomas suspected had been missing for years. She laughed more easily now, made small jokes, expressed opinions on everything from the weather to the best way to cook venison. She was coming back to herself, becoming a person again instead of just an old woman waiting to die. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas pulled down a book from his shelf, a collection of essays he'd read so many times the pages were soft as cloth. "Have you ever considered writing down your stories?" he asked. "The things you've lived through, the people you've known." Eliza looked up from the quilt square she'd been studying, that precious scrap of fabric from her past. "Write them down. Whatever for?" "For the same reason anyone writes anything down, so it isn't forgotten." Thomas set the book aside. "You've lived 93 years, Eliza. You've seen things nobody alive today will ever see. You've crossed the prairie in a wagon, raised children in wild country, survived losses that would have broken most people. Those stories matter. Who would care about an old woman's memories?" She said it without bitterness, just stating what she believed to be fact. "I would. Anyone who reads them would. You think your life was ordinary, but there's no such thing as an ordinary life, just lives that nobody bothered to record." He leaned forward, warming to the idea. "There's a leather-bound journal in the trunk. I bought it years ago with the notion of keeping a record of my days up here, but I never had anything worth saying. You do." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at the quilt square. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Start anywhere. Start with what you remember most clearly, or what you remember most fondly. Start with the hardest thing you survived or the best day you ever lived. Just start and see where it goes." The next morning, Thomas retrieved the journal from the trunk and presented it to her, along with a bottle of ink and 2 good pens he'd been saving. Eliza took them with trembling hands, holding the journal as if it were made of something more precious than leather and paper. "What if I'm not any good at it?" she asked. "Then you'll be not good at it in private, and nobody needs to know. But Eliza, I've heard you talk. You have a way with words. I think you'll surprise yourself." She started that afternoon, sitting at the table with the journal open before her, pen poised over the first blank page. Thomas busied himself with chores, giving her space and privacy. When he came back inside an hour later, she was still writing, her face intent and focused in a way he'd never seen before. That night, she read him what she'd written, a description of crossing the Missouri River as a young bride, the wagon wheels slipping in the mud, the terror and exhilaration of that moment. Her words were simple but vivid, bringing the scene to life in the warm cabin 65 years later. "That's good," Thomas said when she finished. "That's real good." "You think so?" She looked at him with something like hope. "I know so. Keep going." Writing became part of their evening routine. While Thomas read from his small library of books or carved small pieces from scrap wood, Eliza wrote. Sometimes she'd share what she'd written. Other times she'd keep it private. But every day the journal filled with more of her life. Her memories taking shape on the page, becoming permanent and real in a way they'd never been before. For the first time in years, Eliza felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. She was creating something, leaving something behind. Her life wasn't just a series of losses and disappointments to be endured and then forgotten. It was a story worth telling. They developed other routines too. Their chess games became a nightly ritual, each of them winning about half the time, the competition good-natured but genuine. Thomas taught her to identify the calls of different birds, and she shared half-forgotten recipes from her childhood, meals they made together with varying degrees of success. They talked about everything: politics, religion, the nature of the universe, what happened after death. No topic was off-limits, and they disagreed as often as they agreed, but always with respect. One afternoon, Thomas brought out a tin box he kept on the top shelf, one Eliza had noticed but never asked about. He opened it carefully and pulled out 3 photographs. One of a woman holding an infant, another of the same woman alone, and a third of a soldier in uniform who looked like a younger, less weathered version of Thomas. "My wife Sarah and our daughter Margaret," he said quietly, showing Eliza the first photograph. "This was taken a week before they died. And this..." He held up the soldier's portrait. "This is who I was before the war, before I learned what men are capable of doing to each other." Eliza studied the photographs with careful attention. "You've carried these for 42 years. Every place I've been, they're all I have left of who I was." "You're still that man," Eliza said gently, "the one who loved his family. You've just been alone with your grief for so long you forgot." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I thought if I came up here, if I got far enough away from everything, the grief would lose its edge." It did, eventually. "But I lost something else too. The memory of what it felt like to care about someone, to have someone care about me." Eliza reached out and placed her weathered hand over his. "You're remembering now?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They sat like that for a long moment, 2 old people holding hands in the mountain silence, connected by the shared understanding of loss and the unexpected grace of finding companionship when they'd both given up hoping for it. But even as their life together deepened and grew richer, the world outside their cabin door was not content to leave them in peace. Mrs. Polk's visit had been just the beginning. Word of their arrangement had spread throughout Timber Ridge and beyond, and opinions were sharply divided. Some saw it as scandalous, an affront to propriety. Others saw it as a practical arrangement between 2 old people. A very few, saw it for what it was, a quiet act of human dignity in a hard world. Thomas heard the gossip whenever he went to town for supplies. Some people wouldn't meet his eyes. Others made pointed comments about morality and proper Christian behavior. He ignored them all, buying what he needed and leaving without engaging. Let them talk. He'd stopped living for other people's approval 20 years ago. But he couldn't ignore the letter that arrived one afternoon, delivered by a young man from town who'd ridden up specifically to hand it over. The envelope was expensive, the handwriting precise, and Thomas knew before he opened it that it was from Samuel. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. Samuel had made good on his threat. He'd filed a legal challenge to Thomas's competency, claiming that his uncle was being manipulated by an opportunistic woman and was no longer capable of making sound decisions about his property. The letter demanded that Thomas submit to a medical examination and questioning by town officials. If he refused, Samuel would pursue legal guardianship. Eliza saw his expression when he looked up from the letter. "What is it?" "Samuel." Thomas handed her the letter, watching her face darken as she read. He's trying to have me declared incompetent. Because of me. Because he wants the land and doesn't care how he gets it. Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains he'd called home for 2 decades. He's filed with the territorial court. They'll send a delegation, a doctor, probably the mayor, maybe even a judge. They'll interview us, examine me, determine if I'm of sound mind. Eliza set the letter down carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. Thomas, I should leave. If I'm gone, he has no grounds for this claim. No. Thomas turned to face her, his voice firm. That's exactly what he wants. To drive you away, to prove that I can be controlled by fear of scandal or legal trouble. I won't do it, Eliza. I won't send you away to appease a greedy nephew who's never cared about anything but property. But if they declare you incompetent, then we'll deal with it. He came back to the table and sat across from her. I'm not incompetent. I'm not senile. I'm not being manipulated. Any honest examination will prove that. And if it doesn't, well, at least we'll know where we stand. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. I never meant to cause you this much trouble. You didn't cause anything. Samuel's greed caused this. Society's judgment caused this. But you've given me the best months I've had in 20 years. Whatever comes next, I don't regret a single moment of it. That night, neither of them slept well. Thomas lay awake thinking about the coming confrontation, about what he'd say to defend his choices and his dignity. Eliza lay in her alcove, torn between gratitude for what Thomas had given her and guilt over the price he was paying for his kindness. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 riders coming up the mountain trail in a formation that suggested official business. Thomas had been expecting them, and he'd made sure the cabin was clean and orderly, though he refused to change anything fundamental about their living arrangement. Eliza was there, visible and present, because hiding her would be the same as admitting shame. The riders were Mayor William Carson, a portly man in his 50s who'd held office for a decade. Dr. Edmund Walsh, the town physician, carrying his medical bag, and Reverend John Matthews, a thin man with kind eyes who'd spoken out against the gossip about Thomas and Eliza from his pulpit. Thomas appreciated that last detail. At least one of them was coming with an open mind. Mr. Bridger, the mayor said, dismounting with a grunt, thank you for receiving us. I know this is an imposition, but given the nature of Mr. Samuel Bridger's complaint, we're obligated to conduct an inquiry. I understand. Thomas gestured to the cabin. Please come inside. We can speak more comfortably there. They settled around the table, Eliza serving coffee with steady hands, despite her obvious nervousness. Thomas noticed how each man's eyes followed her, assessing, judging, forming opinions based on nothing but appearance and rumor. Dr. Walsh opened his medical bag. Mr. Bridger, with your permission, I'd like to conduct a brief examination. Check your faculties, your memory, your reasoning capacity. Go ahead. The examination was thorough, but not hostile. Dr. Walsh asked Thomas to perform simple arithmetic, recall dates and events from his past, identify objects, follow multi-step instructions. Thomas answered each question calmly and accurately, his mind as sharp as it had ever been. The doctor checked his eyes, his reflexes, listened to his heart and lungs. Physically, you're in remarkable condition for a man of 68, Dr. Walsh said, closing his bag. And mentally, I see no signs of confusion, dementia, or impaired judgment. You're as sound as any man I've examined. The mayor nodded, making notes in a leather journal. Now, Mr. Bridger, perhaps you could explain the circumstances of Mrs. Thornton's residence here. Thomas told the story plainly and without embellishment. How Eliza had appeared at his door, desperate and destitute. How he'd offered her shelter. How their arrangement had evolved into genuine companionship. He didn't apologize or justify. He simply stated facts. And what do you get out of this arrangement? The mayor asked, his tone careful. Company, conversation, another human being to share meals with. Thomas leaned back in his chair. I've lived alone for 20 years, Mayor. It's made me realize that solitude and loneliness are different things, and I'd been the second one without admitting it. Eliza's presence has given me something I didn't know I was missing, a reason to be more than just a man waiting to die. The mayor turned to Eliza. Mrs. Thornton, I need to ask you some questions as well, if you don't mind. Are you here of your own free will? Absolutely. Eliza's voice was steady, stronger than Thomas had heard it in difficult moments before. Has Mr. Bridger made any demands of you, financial, physical, or otherwise? None whatsoever. He's asked nothing except that I accept his hospitality. She paused, then added, I came here expecting to offer labor in exchange for shelter, as that's what the world taught me to expect. Mr. Bridger refused that arrangement. He wanted a companion, not a servant or a wife. That's all this has ever been. Two old people choosing friendship over solitude. Some in town believe the arrangement is improper, the mayor said carefully. Some in town believed it was proper to evict a 93-year-old woman from a boarding house, knowing she had nowhere to go, Eliza responded, and Thomas heard steel beneath the gentleness. I wonder which is truly improper, offering shelter or denying it based on social conventions that serve no one. Reverend Matthews spoke for the first time, his voice thoughtful. Mayor, if I might offer a perspective, I've been considering this situation from a spiritual standpoint, and I keep returning to the story of the Good Samaritan. When a man finds another in need and offers help without expectation of return, we call that charity. We call that Christian virtue. Why then do we condemn the same action when it crosses certain social boundaries? The propriety concerns are legitimate, the mayor said, though he sounded less certain now. Are they? The Reverend gestured to Thomas and Eliza. Look at them, William. Two elderly people who've both buried everyone they loved, who've both reached the end of long, difficult lives. They've found comfort in each other's company. Where is the impropriety in that? Where is the sin? The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Samuel Bridger claims his uncle is being manipulated for his property. Samuel Bridger is a greedy man who sees his inheritance slipping away. Thomas interrupted. He doesn't care about my welfare. He cares about land and timber rights. And I'll tell you what I told him. I'm leaving this property to the town for a school when I die. Let it do some actual good instead of lining his pockets. A school? The mayor's eyebrows rose. You're serious? Perfectly serious. I've already drafted the papers. Eliza helped me. She has a neat hand and understands legal language better than I do. He gestured to the documents stacked on the shelf. The land, the timber rights, everything. It goes to Timber Ridge with the stipulation that it be used for education. If Samuel wants to challenge that, let him try. The three men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Dr. Walsh spoke. Mayor, I can state for the record that Thomas Bridger is of sound mind and body. There is no medical basis for a competency challenge. And I can state, Reverend Matthews added, that I see nothing morally objectionable in this arrangement. If anything, it's an example of Christian charity that the rest of us should learn from. The mayor sighed, closing his journal. Then I'll report back to the territorial court that we find no grounds for Samuel Bridger's complaint. Mr. Bridger is competent. His decisions are his own, and his living arrangement, while unconventional, is neither illegal nor harmful to either party. Relief washed over Thomas like a wave, though he kept his expression neutral. Thank you. However, the mayor continued, I should warn you, Samuel won't be satisfied with this outcome. He may pursue other legal avenues. Let him. I'm not changing my life to suit his greed. As the delegation prepared to leave, Dr. Walsh pulled Thomas aside. I examined Mrs. Thornton briefly while you were showing the Reverend your property deed. She's frail, Thomas. Her heart is weak. She's lived far longer than most people do, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. However much time she has left, I doubt it's years. Maybe months, maybe a bit more if she's fortunate. Thomas felt his chest tighten, but he nodded. I appreciate you telling me. She knows. I could see it in her eyes. She knows her time is short. That's why this matters so much to her, why your kindness has meant what it has. You've given her something precious at the end. Dignity and companionship. That's worth more than all the property in Colorado. After they left, Thomas and Eliza sat together on the porch, watching the riders disappear down the trail. Neither spoke for a long time. There was too much to say, and too little that needed saying. They'd survived the Inquisition. They'd proven their arrangement was legitimate, and their minds were sound. But the doctor's words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. This is the freest I've felt in my entire life, she said softly. However long I have left, I'm grateful to be spending it here with you. Thomas reached over and took her hand, those two weathered hands clasping together on the rough wood of the porch railing. The time we have is all anyone gets, he said, and I'm grateful too. They sat like that until the sun began to set. Two old people who'd found each other at the end of their respective journeys, holding on to the simple miracle of not being alone. 3 weeks of peace followed the delegation's visit. Thomas began to believe that perhaps Samuel had accepted defeat and moved on. It was a foolish hope, and it died on a Thursday afternoon when Samuel returned with a lawyer and a man Thomas had never seen before. The stranger was Chinese, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in clothes that spoke of prosperity, a good wool suit, polished boots, a pocket watch on a gold chain. He carried himself with quiet confidence, and his eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing. Thomas felt an immediate unease, though he couldn't say why. Uncle Thomas, Samuel said, and there was triumph in his voice. I'd like you to meet Mr. James Chen. He's a businessman from San Francisco, and he has some very interesting information about your property claim. Thomas's stomach dropped. The name Chen hit him like a physical blow, bringing memories rushing back. Memories he'd tried to bury for 40 years. Robert Chen, his partner, the man he'd thought dead. Perhaps we should speak inside, the lawyer said, a thin man with wire spectacles and a briefcase full of papers. They gathered around the table, the space suddenly too small and too crowded. Eliza stood near the fireplace, her face pale with worry. Thomas forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, though his heart was hammering. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of documents. Mr. Bridger, according to Territorial Land Office records from 1849, this property was homesteaded under a joint claim filed by you and one Robert Chen. Is that correct? Yes. Thomas's voice came out rough. Robert was my partner. We worked the claim together for 5 years. And what happened to Mr. Chen? He disappeared in the winter of 1854. I assumed he died. There was an avalanche that season. Several men were killed. I searched for him but found no body. After 2 years, I filed papers claiming the land as sole owner, as was legal when a partner was presumed dead. Except Robert Chen wasn't dead, Samuel said, leaning forward. He fled the territory after anti-Chinese violence drove him out. He went to California, changed his name slightly to avoid detection, and built a successful life. He died 3 years ago, but not before telling his family about the land he'd been forced to abandon, and the partner who'd worked it with him. James Chen spoke for the first time, his English perfect and unaccented. My grandfather spoke of you often, Mr. Bridger. He called you his brother. He said you were the one white man in the territory who treated him as an equal, who defended him against those who wanted to drive all Chinese workers away. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. Robert, your grandfather, he was the best man I ever knew. When he disappeared, I thought I'd lost another person I cared about. I grieved for him. I believe you, James said quietly. But the legal facts remain. My grandfather never relinquished his claim to this land. He was driven away by violence and threats, not by choice. Under territorial law, his claim, and therefore his family's claim, is still valid. The lawyer spread several documents across the table. This is a copy of the original joint filing. This is the deed Robert Chen carried with him to California. And this, he pointed to a third document. This is a letter of intent from Samuel Bridger to purchase James Chen's half of the property claim for a substantial sum. Understanding crashed over Thomas like a cold wave. You found Robert's grandson and convinced him that I'd cheated his grandfather. You're planning to buy his half of the claim, then force me out of my own home. Not exactly, Samuel said smoothly. We're offering you a choice. Sign over the property to me willingly, and I'll pay you a fair price. You can retire to town, live comfortably for your remaining years, or fight this in court, spend years in legal battles, and likely lose anyway. The joint claim is valid. James has every right to his grandfather's share. Thomas turned to James Chen. Did Samuel tell you the whole story? Did he tell you that Robert and I were brothers in every way but blood? That we planned to work this land together, build something together? He told me you took the land after my grandfather disappeared. He told me you profited from property that should have been shared. James's expression was conflicted. Is that not true? It's partially true, but it leaves out everything that matters. Thomas stood and crossed to the shelf where he kept his most precious possessions. His hands shook as he reached for the small wooden box he hadn't opened in decades. Robert didn't just disappear. He was driven away by men who couldn't stand the thought of a Chinese man owning land. They burned his tent, threatened to kill him, ran him off in the middle of winter. I tried to stop them, got beaten for my trouble. When I woke up, Robert was gone. I thought they'd killed him and hidden the body. He opened the box and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and a jade pendant on a leather cord. But before he left, Robert came to my cabin one last time. He left these for me. The paper was a letter, written in English with a few Chinese characters mixed in. Thomas unfolded it carefully, his vision blurring with tears as he read words he'd memorized 40 years ago. My brother Thomas, he read aloud, I leave tonight before they come back to finish what they started. I cannot stay in a place where men would rather kill me than let me live in peace. But I want you to know, this land is ours together, yours and mine. We built it with our hands and our sweat, and no amount of hatred can change that. If I cannot return, then it is yours with my blessing and my love. The jade pendant I leave with you is from my grandfather. In my family, it symbolizes eternal brotherhood. Wear it and remember that distance cannot break what we built together. Signed, your brother, Robert Chen. The silence in the cabin was absolute. James Chen stared at the letter, then at the pendant, his face pale with shock. He left that for you, James whispered. 40 years ago. Thomas held out the pendant. I've kept it all this time. I wore it for years, under my shirt where nobody could see. After a while, it hurt too much to wear something that reminded me of everything I'd lost. So I put it in this box. But I never forgot him. Never. James took the pendant with trembling hands, examining it closely. This was my great-grandfather's. My grandfather spoke of it, said he'd left his most precious possession with the man he trusted most in the world. He looked up at Thomas, tears in his own eyes now. Samuel told me you'd taken advantage of my grandfather's absence. He said you'd stolen the land and prospered while my grandfather died poor in California. Robert died poor? Thomas's voice broke. I didn't know. I hoped. I prayed he'd found a good life somewhere. If I'd known where he was, I would have sent him money, shared everything I had. He didn't die poor, James corrected quietly. He built a successful merchant business in San Francisco, but Samuel told me that story to make me angry, to make me want revenge. He manipulated me, used my family's history to serve his own greed. Samuel's face flushed red. This doesn't change the legal facts. The joint claim is worth nothing if my grandfather willingly relinquished it," James interrupted, his voice hardening as he turned to face Samuel. "This letter is clear. He gave his share to Thomas Bridger. He wanted his partner, his brother, to have the land." "That's not a legal document," the lawyer protested. "It wouldn't hold up in court." "Then we won't go to court," James said firmly. He turned back to Thomas, and there was something like wonder in his expression. "Mr. Bridger, my grandfather spoke of you until the day he died. He said you were the only man in the gold camps who defended Chinese workers, who stood up to the mobs. He said you saved his life twice, once from a mine collapse and once from men who would have murdered him. He called you his brother, and that word meant everything to him." "He saved my life too," Thomas said roughly, "more than once. And he taught me things I needed to learn: patience, perspective, how to see past the surface of things. I was a better man for knowing him." James looked at the pendant in his hands, then back at Thomas. "I came here believing you'd wronged my family. Instead, I find that you were the family my grandfather chose, the brother he never forgot." He took a deep breath. "Mr. Bridger, I'm withdrawing any claim to this property. My grandfather gave it to you, and his wishes should be honored." "You can't do that." Samuel was on his feet now, his face twisted with rage. "We had a deal. We had a deal based on lies," James said coldly. "You told me Thomas Bridger was a thief who'd stolen from my grandfather. You showed me the joint claim and painted a story of betrayal. But this letter, this pendant, these tell a different story. The true story." Samuel turned to his lawyer. "Can he do this? Can he just walk away?" The lawyer studied the letter carefully. "If this is genuine, and it appears to be, it constitutes a voluntary relinquishment of claim. Combined with Mr. Bridger's 40 years of continuous occupation and his good faith assumption of sole ownership, any court would rule in his favor. Pursuing this further would be expensive and futile." "No." Samuel's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of utter defeat. "You're all against me, my own uncle, some stranger, all of you." "Samuel," Thomas's voice cut through his nephew's despair. "This was never about being against you. It was about you being against decency, against compassion, against everything your father tried to teach you about what matters in life." "My father died with nothing," Samuel shouted. "He worked himself to death and left nothing behind. You had land, valuable land, and you were going to throw it away on a school and an old woman who had nowhere else to go," Eliza said quietly from her place by the fire. She'd been so still during the confrontation that Thomas had almost forgotten she was there. "An old woman who reminded your uncle that property isn't worth as much as human connection. That's what frightens you, isn't it, Samuel? Not that you might lose an inheritance, but that you might end up like your uncle, alone for 20 years, with nothing but property to keep you company." Samuel stared at her, and Thomas saw his nephew's face crack, saw the fear beneath the greed. "I'm 42 years old," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "I've spent my whole adult life building wealth, climbing the social ladder in Denver, and I have no wife, no children, no real friends. Just clients and associates and people who want something from me. I watched my father work himself to death for nothing, and I swore I'd be different. I'd have security. I'd have something that lasted." "But you're ending up the same way he did," Thomas said gently. "Just with more money and even less happiness. Samuel, it's not too late to change, to find what actually matters. It feels too late." Samuel collapsed back into his chair, his face in his hands. "I've burned every bridge. I tried to have you declared incompetent. I lied to James about his grandfather. I've spent months scheming to take your land. How do I come back from that?" Thomas looked at Eliza, then at James Chen, then back at his nephew. "The same way any of us come back from our mistakes, one honest step at a time." The lawyer left first, recognizing that his services were no longer needed and perhaps uncomfortable with how the situation had unfolded. Samuel sat at the table for a long time in silence, staring at nothing while James Chen and Thomas talked quietly about Robert, sharing memories and filling in 40 years of missing story. James told them about his grandfather's life in California, how Robert had arrived with nothing and built a successful import business, how he'd married a woman from his village and raised 3 children, how he'd always spoken of the mountains and the brother he'd left behind. "He never blamed you," James said. "He understood why you thought he was dead. He knew you'd searched for him, but he couldn't come back, not while the men who'd driven him away were still there, still powerful enough to finish what they'd started." "I would have protected him," Thomas said, "or died trying." "He knew that too. That's why he left, to keep you from dying for him." They talked for hours, piecing together parallel lives that should have remained intertwined but had been severed by hatred and violence. Eliza served them coffee and listened, adding quiet observations that helped both men see their shared history more clearly. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, Samuel stood up. "I should go. I need to—" He paused, seeming lost. "I don't know what I need to do, but I know I can't stay here." "Samuel," Thomas said, rising to face his nephew. "I meant what I said. It's not too late. You're 42, not 90. You have time to build something real, relationships, connections, a life that means something beyond money. I don't know how. None of us do at first. We learn by trying." Thomas pulled out a piece of paper and wrote an address. "This is Reverend Matthews in Timber Ridge. He's a good man, a thoughtful man. If you want to talk to someone about starting over, he'd be a good place to begin." Samuel took the paper, folding it carefully and putting it in his pocket. "Why are you helping me? After everything I've done?" "Because you're my brother's son. Because you're family, even if we've never been close. And because I believe people can change, if they want to badly enough." Thomas paused. "Also because holding on to anger takes too much energy, and I don't have energy to spare." After Samuel left, James Chen stayed. He asked if he could see the property, walk the land his grandfather had helped homestead. Thomas and Eliza took him on a tour, showing him the cleared fields, the creek where they'd panned for gold, the old mine shaft they'd worked before realizing the real wealth was in timber and farmland. "This is beautiful," James said, standing on a ridge and looking out over the valley below. "I can see why my grandfather loved it here, why he was willing to fight for it." "Robert had vision," Thomas agreed. "He saw what this land could be long before I did. He's the one who suggested we stop chasing gold and start building something permanent." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, James made a decision. "Mr. Bridger, I want to honor my grandfather's wishes, but I also want to do something meaningful with this unexpected connection. What if—" He paused, working through the idea. "What if we used part of the land for the school you mentioned, but also established a fund to support it? My grandfather's business is successful. I could contribute capital, and we could name it after Robert Chen. Make sure his legacy is remembered." Thomas felt his throat tighten. That would be remarkable. "But James, you don't owe me anything. The land is mine, your grandfather made that clear." "It's not about owing," James interrupted. "It's about building what my grandfather and you started, a place where different people could work together, where heritage didn't matter as much as character. That's what a school could be, a place where children learn that lesson from the start." They talked details as they walked back to the cabin, how much land to designate, how to structure the fund, what the school should teach. By the time they reached the porch, they'd sketched out a plan that honored Robert's memory and served the community. "There's one more thing," James said as he prepared to leave. "My grandfather drew maps of this land, marked places where he'd found gold deposits that weren't worth mining at the time but might be valuable now with better technology. Would you let me search for them? If we find anything significant, We could use the profits for the school. Robert kept maps. Thomas was surprised. I never knew. He was meticulous, kept records of everything. James smiled. It's how he built his business. Careful attention to details others missed. Then yes, by all means. Search wherever you like. This land was as much his as mine. After James left, promising to return in a few days with some of his grandfather's papers, Thomas and Eliza sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. That was unexpected, Eliza said softly. All of it. Samuel breaking down, James turning out to be Robert's grandson. The possibility of actually building something good from all this chaos. Thomas shook his head. I thought I'd come up here to die quietly. Instead, I seem to be creating a legacy. You invited me inside, Eliza reminded him. Everything else followed from that one choice. Best decision I ever made. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Thomas thought about the turn his life had taken, how a simple act of kindness had spiraled outward, touching lives he'd never expected to touch, connecting past and future in ways he couldn't have imagined. The next morning, James returned with a leather satchel full of papers. He spread them across the table. Maps, sketches, notations in both English and Chinese. Robert Chen had documented everything, including detailed drawings of the land with marks indicating where he'd found traces of gold, silver, and other valuable minerals. My grandfather believed this land had wealth beyond what you'd already extracted, James explained. But he also believed that wealth should serve a purpose beyond making individuals rich. He wrote notes in the margins here. He pointed to Chinese characters alongside a map. He says the gold deposits near the creek should be used to build something permanent, something that would outlast individual lives. Thomas studied the maps with growing amazement. Robert had marked dozens of sites, each with careful notations about what he'd found and his assessment of its potential value. Some were marked with a special symbol, a character that James translated as sacred or protected. These marked sites are near places my grandfather considered spiritually significant, James explained. He wouldn't have wanted them disturbed, even for valuable minerals. We'll honor that, Thomas said immediately. But the others, if there's enough value there, we could fund a school that would serve this community for generations. Over the following days, they explored the property together, James with his grandfather's maps and Thomas with his memory of the land and Robert's stories. Eliza often accompanied them, her presence a quiet reminder of what had started this whole chain of events. They found the sites Robert had marked, and James, who had experience with mining operations through his business, assessed their potential. Some were played out or had never been as valuable as Robert hoped. But others, especially near the creek, showed real promise. This would require proper equipment and expertise, James said, standing beside a rock face where mineral deposits glinted in the sunlight. But there's wealth here. Probably enough to build and endow a school that could operate for decades. Thomas felt a strange emotion welling up, something between grief and joy. Robert had known. 40 years ago, his partner and brother had mapped these treasures, had planned for a future where they'd use this wealth together for something meaningful. And now, across the gap of decades and death, Robert's vision was coming to fruition. We'll need partners, James said as they walked back toward the cabin. Mining experts, businessmen who can structure the operation properly. It'll take time to set up. I've got nothing but time, Thomas replied, then paused. Well, actually, that's not true. None of us know how much time we have, but whatever time I've got left, I want to spend it making this happen. That evening, as Thomas and Eliza prepared supper while James reviewed more of his grandfather's papers, there was a knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find a young woman standing there, her clothes worn and her face showing the exhaustion of hard travel. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Sarah Webb. I have nowhere else to go. Someone in Timber Ridge said you'd taken in a woman who needed help, and I thought maybe—" She swallowed hard. "I thought maybe you'd help me too." Thomas looked at Eliza, who had appeared beside him. She was smiling, that gentle smile she wore when something pleased her deeply. "Of course you can come in," Thomas said, stepping back. "Come in and get warm. We'll figure out the rest after you've eaten and rested." As Sarah Webb stepped over the threshold, Thomas realized that his cabin was becoming something he'd never intended, a haven for the lost and desperate, a place where people who'd been told they had no value could find dignity and purpose. And strangely, wonderfully, that felt exactly right. "I think," Eliza said softly as they settled Sarah at the table and began preparing food, "that this cabin is becoming what it was always meant to be. Not a hiding place, but a home. Not for one person or two, but for anyone who needs what you offered me. Shelter, respect, and the simple acknowledgement that every life matters." Thomas looked around his cabin, at James Chen studying his grandfather's maps, at Sarah Webb grateful and crying into her coffee, at Eliza moving through the space with quiet purpose. His solitary refuge had transformed into something else entirely, and while part of him mourned the loss of his peaceful isolation, a larger part rejoiced at what had replaced it. "Robert would approve," he said quietly. "He always believed in building something bigger than ourselves." "So did you," Eliza replied. "You just needed reminding." That night, after their guests had settled in, Sarah in the alcove with Eliza, James in his bedroll by the fire, Thomas sat alone on the porch. The mountains rose around him in the darkness, familiar and eternal. He'd come here to hide from the world, to nurse his grief in private, to wait for death in peace. Instead, by opening his door to one desperate woman, he discovered something he'd forgotten, that life, even at its end, was meant to be lived in connection with others, that meaning came from what we gave rather than what we protected, that legacy wasn't about property but about the life we touched and the kindness we showed. Tomorrow, they'd start planning the school. They'd explore more of Robert's mapped sites. They'd figure out what to do with Sarah Webb and whatever her story turned out to be. There was work ahead, complications and challenges, and the messiness of human relationships. And Thomas found, to his surprise, that he was looking forward to all of it. Samuel watched his hired men ride away, his face cycling through emotions, rage, disbelief, desperation. The gun in his hand shook, and Thomas recognized the look of a man who'd gambled everything on one final play and was watching it collapse. "Don't do this," Thomas said quietly. "Samuel, put the gun down. It's over." "It's not over," Samuel's voice cracked. "I've invested everything in this. Time, money, my reputation. I promised people I'd deliver on this deal. If I go back to Denver with nothing—" He swallowed hard. "I borrowed money to hire these men, to pay the lawyer. Money I don't have. If I can't deliver the land, I'm ruined." Understanding flooded through Thomas. This wasn't just about greed or inheritance. Samuel had leveraged everything on the assumption he'd get the land, and now he was facing financial catastrophe. "Why didn't you just ask for help?" Thomas asked. "Why all the schemes and manipulation?" "Because asking for help is admitting failure. It's what weak men do, desperate men." Samuel stopped, hearing his own words. "Men like my father, men like you." "Your father wasn't weak," Thomas said firmly. "He was a good man who worked hard and did his best. And I'm not weak either. I was broken, Samuel. There's a difference. I came up here to heal, not to hide, even if it took me 20 years to understand that. I can't go back empty-handed." Samuel's gun hand dropped slightly. "I owe too much. I've promised too much." James Chen spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "What if you didn't go back empty-handed? What if we gave you something more valuable than land?" "James," Thomas started, but James held up a hand. "Hear me out. James looked at Samuel with something like pity. "You're a banker, Samuel. You understand finance and business structure. What if, instead of taking the land, you helped us develop it properly? The mining operation, the school funding. We need someone who understands money and contracts and legal structures. We could pay you fairly for that expertise, help you clear your debts, and you'd be part of something meaningful instead of just chasing inheritance." Samuel stared at him. "You'd trust me after I came here with guns?" "No," James said honestly, "but I'd give you a chance to earn that trust. My grandfather believed in second chances. That's why he gave Thomas his blessing even after being driven from the land. I think he'd want me to extend the same grace to you." The two remaining ranch hands exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Mr. Bridger, this really isn't what we signed up for. We thought we were coming to witness a legal transaction, not stage an armed robbery. We're going to head back now." They rode off, leaving Samuel completely alone. His gun hand dropped to his side, and Thomas watched his nephew's shoulders slump in defeat. The fight had gone out of him, leaving only exhaustion and shame. "I've made such a mess of everything," Samuel said quietly. He looked at the gun in his hand as if surprised to find it there, then carefully holstered it. "I came here threatening violence. Why would any of you help me now?" "Because we've all made messes," Eliza said, emerging from the cabin with Sarah beside her. "I spent the last 10 years being passed from one reluctant relative to another, convinced I was nothing but a burden. Thomas hid in these mountains for 20 years instead of facing his grief. We've all done things we're not proud of. The question isn't whether you've failed. It's what you do next." Samuel looked at her. This tiny old woman he'd dismissed as a gold digger and manipulator, and seemed to really see her for the first time. "You don't hate me. After I tried to drive you away, to have my uncle declared incompetent. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on better things," Eliza replied. "But I won't pretend what you did was acceptable. You hurt people because you were hurting. That doesn't excuse it, but it might explain it." Thomas stepped down from the porch, approaching his nephew slowly. "Samuel, James is making you a genuine offer. You have skills we need. You could help turn this land into something that serves the community for generations. But it would mean being part of a team, taking direction, working for something beyond your own profit. Could you do that?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing across his face. Pride warring with desperation, old habits of self-interest fighting against the possibility of redemption. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can, but I'd like to try." "That's all any of us can do," Thomas said. He extended his hand, and after a hesitation, Samuel took it. The handshake was tentative, fragile, but it was a beginning. James pulled papers from his satchel, the maps and documents that Samuel had come to steal. "These are my grandfather's plans for this land. Let's go inside and look at them together. If you're serious about helping, we need someone who can turn these ideas into a viable business structure." As they all moved toward the cabin, Sarah Webb spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Bridger, the younger Mr. Bridger, I'm good with numbers and bookkeeping. I worked in a factory office before the seamstress job. If you need help organizing financial documents, I could assist." Samuel looked at her with surprise, then at the assembled group, his uncle who should hate him, the Chinese businessman he'd tried to manipulate, the old woman he'd dismissed, and now this young woman offering help despite witnessing his worst behavior. "I don't deserve any of this," he said. "Probably not," Thomas agreed. "But grace isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to help someone become better than they've been. Robert taught me that 40 years ago. He saw something worth saving in a bitter, angry ex-soldier, and he was patient enough to let me find it. I can do the same for you if you're willing." They gathered around the table inside the cabin, spreading out Robert Chen's maps and plans. As James explained his grandfather's vision and Samuel began asking questions about mineral rights and corporate structures, Thomas caught Eliza's eye. She smiled at him, that gentle smile that had become so familiar, and he knew they were thinking the same thing. This cabin, which had been a hiding place for so long, had become a place of healing, not just for him and Eliza, but for everyone who came through its door looking for something they'd lost, purpose, dignity, redemption, hope. "You know," Samuel said, studying one of the maps, "if we structure the mining operation as a cooperative with profit sharing for the workers and establish the school as a trust with guaranteed funding from the mineral extraction, we could create something sustainable, something that would last beyond any of our lifetimes." "Now you're thinking like your grandfather would have wanted," James said approvingly. Thomas listened to them plan, watched Sarah take notes with careful precision, saw Eliza moving about the cabin, making sure everyone had coffee and food. This was what Robert had envisioned all those years ago. People working together, differences set aside in service of something larger than individual gain. Outside, the Colorado sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the mountain air. Spring was coming in earnest now, bringing new life to the land Robert Chen and Thomas Bridger had claimed together half a century ago. And inside the cabin, that same spirit of renewal was taking root in the hearts of 5 people who'd all arrived broken in different ways, but were leaving pieces of their brokenness behind. 6 months later, in the warmth of early September, Thomas stood on a newly cleared piece of land about half a mile from his cabin. Behind him rose the frame of a building, the Robert Chen Memorial School, named for the man whose vision had made it possible. The structure was simple but solid, built to last generations, with large windows to let in mountain light and a stone fireplace that would keep the children warm through winter. James Chen had returned to San Francisco, but visited monthly, overseeing the mining operation he'd established with Thomas's blessing. True to Samuel's restructuring, the operation employed local men at fair wages with profit sharing, and a percentage of every ounce of gold or silver extracted went directly into the school's endowment. Already the fund had grown substantial enough to guarantee teacher salaries and supplies for at least 20 years. Samuel himself had surprised everyone, including himself. He'd relocated from Denver to Timber Ridge, where he'd opened a small office handling legal and financial matters for the mining cooperative and helping other local businesses with their bookkeeping. He lived simply now, in a room above the general store, and while he wasn't wealthy, he was solvent and, more importantly, useful. Last week, he'd helped a widow negotiate fair prices for her late husband's timber claim. He'd taken no commission, just the satisfaction of doing right. "You're miles away," Eliza said, appearing beside Thomas with a cup of water. She moved more slowly now than she had 6 months ago, and Thomas noticed she needed to rest more often. But her eyes were still bright, still engaged with the world around her. "Just thinking about everything that's changed," Thomas replied, accepting the water gratefully. "About Robert and what he'd think of all this. He'd be proud, I imagine. Not just of the school, but of you, of all of us." Eliza settled onto a nearby bench, one Samuel had built and placed there specifically for her. "We've created something good from difficult circumstances." Sarah Webb emerged from the school building, her arms full of books. James had hired her to be the school's first teacher, and she'd thrown herself into preparing with the fervor of someone who'd found their calling. She'd been studying at night, working through teaching manuals James had sent from San Francisco, and she'd proven to have a natural gift for explaining complex ideas in simple terms. "Mrs. Thornton, could you come look at these primers?" Sarah called. "I want to make sure they're appropriate for different age levels." Eliza rose with some effort, and Thomas automatically offered his arm for support. She took it without hesitation, and they walked together toward the school, moving at the slower pace Eliza's aging body required. Inside, the school smelled of fresh-cut pine and possibility. Desks were arranged in neat rows, a chalkboard hung on the front wall, and shelves waited to be filled with more books. In the corner sat Eliza's completed memoir, bound in leather and displayed prominently, the first book in what would become a library of local histories and memories. "I think these will work perfectly," Eliza said after examining the primers. "You've done wonderful work preparing for this, Sarah." "I just want to do right by the children," Sarah replied. "Some of them will come from families that have never had much education. This might be their only chance." The school was set to open in 2 weeks. Already, families from throughout the region had registered their children. Some would board in town during the week, others would ride in daily, and a few hardy mountain families would send their children down on Monday and collect them on Friday. 23 students, ranging from 6 to 14 years, bold, waiting to learn. That evening, as had become their custom, the extended group gathered at Thomas's cabin for supper. Samuel brought fresh bread from town. James, visiting again, contributed dried fruits from California. Sarah arrived with a stew she'd been perfecting, and Thomas and Eliza provided the space and the welcome that had started everything. "I received a letter today," James announced as they ate, "from the Territorial Governor's office. They've heard about our cooperative mining operation and the school funding model. They're interested in using it as a template for other communities." Robert's vision spreading beyond these mountains, Thomas said softly. He'd have liked that. "There's more," James continued. "They want to recognize the school formally. There will be a ceremony when it opens, with territorial officials present. They want to honor not just my grandfather's memory, but also—" He paused, looking at Thomas and Eliza. "They want to recognize the two of you for creating a model of community support and care that they believe others should follow." Eliza laughed, a genuine sound of delight and disbelief. "They want to honor a 94-year-old woman who showed up at a stranger's door begging for shelter? They want to honor a woman who proved that age doesn't diminish worth," James corrected gently, "and a man who proved that compassion can change everything." The meal continued with easy conversation and laughter, but as the evening drew to a close and the others prepared to leave, Eliza asked Thomas to walk with her outside. They stood on the porch, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed their entire story. "I need to tell you something," Eliza said quietly. "Dr. Walsh visited me last week when I was in town. My heart is weaker. He doesn't think I have much time left. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a couple of months if I'm fortunate." Thomas felt his chest tighten, though he'd known this moment was coming. "How do you feel about it?" "Grateful," Eliza said, and there was no fear in her voice. "When I walked up here last February, I was ready to die. I'd outlived everyone I loved, served no purpose, had no reason to continue. I thought maybe I'd freeze in these mountains and that would be a mercy. Instead, I found you. I found purpose. I wrote my story. I helped create a school that will teach children for generations. I've lived more in these 7 months than I had in the previous 10 years. "I'm not ready to lose you," Thomas admitted. "You're not losing me. I'll be in that memoir, in the school library. I'll be in the stories people tell about how this all started. And Thomas," she took his weathered hand in hers, "you know how to open the door now. When someone else comes seeking shelter, seeking dignity, you'll know what to do. That's the gift we've given each other, the knowledge that compassion is never wasted, that dignity matters at every age, that one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we can't predict." They stood together in the mountain night, two old people who'd found each other at the end of their journeys and had created something that would outlast them both. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But between them, in the space of 7 months, everything had changed. The school opened 2 weeks later on a crisp autumn morning. 23 children filed into the Robert Chen Memorial School, their faces bright with excitement and nervousness. Sarah Webb stood at the front of the classroom, ready to begin her new life as their teacher. Samuel managed the official paperwork and finances with meticulous care. James gave a speech about his grandfather's vision and the power of partnership across differences, and in the front row, in a place of honor, sat Eliza May Thornton beside Thomas Bridger. She was weak now, her body finally surrendering to time, but her eyes were clear and her spirit unbroken. She watched the children settle into their desks, saw Sarah begin the first lesson, and knew that her life had mattered after all. She would live only 3 more weeks, passing peacefully in her sleep in the alcove that had become her home. Thomas found her in the morning, still holding the quilt square from her first daughter, a peaceful expression on her face. They buried her on the hill overlooking the school, and the entire community turned out to honor her. Samuel read from her memoir. Sarah spoke about how Eliza's courage had inspired her own. James placed a jade pendant, a twin to his grandfather's, commissioned especially for this purpose, on her grave as a symbol of the brotherhood between different people that both Eliza and Robert had championed. And Thomas stood beside the grave, dry-eyed but grieving, and spoke the only words that mattered. She told me she had nothing left to offer. She was wrong. She had everything that mattered, and she gave it freely. May we all be so generous with the time we're given. Years later, when Thomas himself passed, quietly in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, they buried him beside Eliza on the hill overlooking the school. The Robert Chen Memorial School continued to thrive, teaching generation after generation of children that worth isn't measured by wealth or youth, that dignity transcends social conventions, and that one act of compassion can change the world. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the mountain wind whispered through the pines, people swore they could hear echoes of laughter from that old cabin. The sound of 2 old people who'd found each other at the end of their journeys, and proved that it's never too late to matter, never too late to make a difference, never too late to choose love over loneliness and compassion over convention. The door remained open, as Thomas had promised, and though many years have passed since that February morning when Eliza May Thornton knocked softly and changed everything, the lesson remains. Sometimes the greatest thing we can offer another person is the simple acknowledgement of their worth, the simple act of opening a door and saying, "Yes, you matter, you belong, you're welcome here." That message, carved into a plaque at the school's entrance, continues to greet every student who walks through those doors. In memory of Eliza May Thornton and Thomas Bridger, who proved that dignity, compassion, and human worth matter more than convention. May we honor their legacy by opening doors to those in need, and by recognizing that every life, regardless of age or circumstance, has value beyond measure.